pseudoscience, if you will, was really about the context in the United States in the 1910s and 20s when we saw unprecedented levels of immigration from Southern Europe and what was deemed as quote unquote less desirable parts of the world. In the US, the reigning Puritan white Protestant elite were in many ways horrified by the onslaught of these immigrant populations. And eugenics served a purpose. It served a purpose of social order, of affirming their place in that hierarchy, and establishing an America that that replicated their priorities. So thank you very much, Ellen and Max and Kristen, for courageously joining me in this conversation.
Courageously.
Not everyone, not every institution we have asked has agreed to participate. And I think part of that is because it does take courage. As each of you has, I believe,
When from Austria, you
genuinely
better join, you
at
know.
your respective institutions. And so I'd love to just maybe begin with you, Ellen, to talk about the American Museum of Natural History. Because Henry
I was
Fairfield
there
Osborne
yesterday.
sponsored 2 of the 3 major eugenics conferences. And of course, he had an affiliation with your institution. And the American Museum of Natural History is a preeminent scientific institution known around the world for scientific excellence. And
An
yet,
experiment.
you have this legacy. How, Ellen, do you, as its leader today, reflect on that legacy?
Well, thank you, Darren. And let me just begin by thanking not only you for the introduction on behalf of all of us, but also you and the other co-chairs and organizers of this conference for having it. And it's a very important moment for all of us. But I also want to do my introduction properly. I'm Ellen Futter. I'm the president of the American Museum of Natural History. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am sitting in my offices at the American Museum of Natural History, which is very much on the ancestral lands of the Lenape. I am wearing glasses, and I am wearing a black jacket consistent with the uniform of all New York women. I want to turn, though, now
Manhattan Marxism, okay.
the question that you asked. 100 years ago, one of my early predecessors welcomed attendees to the second International Eugenics Conference. I think the most direct response to your question, Darren, is to say, today, my colleagues and I welcome the opportunity to confront and acknowledge that part of our history and to express our profound regret for it. In addition, I would add to that the pseudoscience of eugenics is absolutely antithetical to the values, the mission, and the work of our museum.
Good.
Is, I think, as you know, one of the most welcoming and accessible institutions anywhere, and supports scientific research and education to inform the public about real science. I also can't help but note that this is an extraordinarily well-timed gathering, not merely because of the 100 years that have passed, but I think far more fundamentally because we can see and hear echoes of the eugenics legacy around us today in the anti-immigration rhetoric, in racism, in anti-Semitism, and other religious discrimination.
Very correct.
Discrimination against people with disability, and in gender violence. And I think that this kind of reckoning is particularly important because
then why was I beaten Latino black on white on 131st Street? Because Harlem should not be
to
black.
advance what may well be abhorrent, non-scientific approaches. And I think that our capacity
Should be mixed.
contend with that is really critical. So I think of this as a moment for us to reckon and to shed light on these issues. It was Ida B. Wells who said once that the way to address issues of this nature is to shed light on them. And I want to thank you again for giving us the opportunity to shed that light. It needs it.
Thank you, Ellen. Cristian, you lead an organization that has a very checkered history here. And of course, what most people know of is the Wildlife Conservation Society's physical presence in the Bronx and New York City, but you're a global organization. Part of that knowledge of it as a physical place in the context of eugenics is because of the legacy of Ota Benga, which I believe, and I know you believe, and your board believe, is a stain on the history of WCS. Talk about how you today, as Ellen just discussed, you today lead an organization with that legacy into the future.
Thank you, Darren, and it's a great pleasure to be with you and Ellen and Max today. Let me start with my own introduction. So my name is Cristian Samper. I'm the president and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society. My pronouns are he, him, or his. And I'm joining you from New York City, in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape. I'm a middle-aged white man. I'm of Hispanic origin, grew up in Colombia. So I was raised as bicultural and bilingual. I'm wearing a blue shirt with a blue jacket, no tie, and I'm sitting here in my library.
So you
I very much appreciate your introduction as we reflect on our past.
Yeah.
And last year actually marked the 125th anniversary of WCS. But it was a moment for us to reflect on our past, the good things we did, the bad things, and needless to say, there are elements of our history we're not proud of, and that we all have to live with. One of those, as you mentioned, was the episode about Ota Benga, this African man that was brought over to the U.S. For the St. Louis Welfare, which was displayed at the Bronx Zoo.
Of course, like in Paris,
it is
like
a stain in our history.
Like
it's something we reject clearly, and it's something we have publicly apologized for in the past. But as you say, it very much was one moment, one element in a history where many of our founders, including Henry Fairfield Osborn and others, were very much sort of the mainstream of the discussion around eugenics, which, as Ellen mentioned, was very much focused on pseudoscience and values that we certainly reject and do not share today. I think what we've looked at is certainly some of the ideals of some of our founders, which are very much about sort of the nature being there at our service and something that was there for us to enjoy and protect so that some of our people could visit it, did not take into account the profound relationship that, say, Native American tribes and others had with this. And we can come to this a little bit later on. But clearly, what we have done over the years is continue to evolve our thinking. Certainly, the work that we do around conservation around the world is important, but with profound and deep respect for the diversity, for the inclusion, and for the richness of this planet that we share with millions and millions of species. So I think I agree with Ellen. It's very timely to have this on the 100th anniversary, especially given the moment that our nation is going through right now.
Thank you. Max Hollein, Director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
That pronunciation.
Thank you, Darren. And let me introduce myself. I'm Max Hollein, the Marine Academy French Director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm calling in here from my office at the Met in New York. And the Metropolitan Museum is situated on Lenapehoking, which is the homeland of the Lenape diaspora. I'm a Caucasian man. I wear a blue suit, a purple and white striped shirt, and a blue tie. So thank you again also from my side to for inviting me, for inviting us, for inviting the Metropolitan Museum to be part of this conversation,
can't even get it
which
right,
is,
Max
of course, not only a challenging one, but it's an important one, a relevant one, where I would say every institution, one way or the other, plays a role. And it's ingrained in our history, and especially for institutions that basically deal more often than not also with the past. I think it's more important than ever to not only look at the past, do a reckoning with our own history, but actually also almost like archaeological sediments, make it more obvious what happened, what biases are already ingrained in our institutions, and how can we make that more obvious? How can we kind of react to it and see what has happened and what should not have happened? But also on the other hand, make sure that what we do is so to say proactive in trying to so to say not only overcome what has been done wrongly, but actually also expanding our horizon in multiple ways. So I think if you walk through the Met and if you look at the history of the Met, you will find very similar, I would say, developments that have happened all across the country. The Met was founded in 1870 by basically, yes, white Protestant men who probably just coming back from Europe wanted to create an institution that certainly was very much based on Western ideas, Western values, also Western biases. And on the other hand, it was clear from the very beginning that we wanted to be an encyclopedic institution. So now all of that is kind of baked into one. It has its certainly its great developments, its great merits, but also its deep flaws. And I think we are here to discuss some of them. And I'm joining this conversation and this discussion with a very open eyes and also with an open mind, and with a lot of things that I think we have also done in the past years.
Yeah, so I think it'd be really interesting to hear each of your thoughts on this question as to how your institution, when you look at that history, what did your institution do to advance these ideas of eugenics? What did your institution do you believe, as you look at the ways in which eugenics sought to valorize sort of Northern European ideas of beauty, to categorize what was fit and unfit, and across the kind of continuum, what was normal and what was abnormal, how these ideas of Darwin and all sorts of things came into play, the ways in which things like disability, I mean, you know, how even just these ideas were propagated that having a disability and was something abnormal, and the ways in which we just simply normalized what were pretty pernicious ideas. And Ellen, certainly because natural history, and I know you and I have talked about this idea of natural often is constructed, and I'd love you to just talk about this from your standpoint.
Over there lives the man.
Well, I think for us, it's most manifest in the fact that obviously a far too narrow Western European perspective was brought to presentation and exhibition. And I think another way of saying it is everything that wasn't that was treated as other. And it's the othering of people who aren't the same, almost as you would treat other species, thinking of a natural history museum. And that perspective is not only narrow, it leads to stereotyping, and it's inaccurate. It can also manifest itself, though, in how artifacts from people of other cultures are considered. For example, perhaps more as craft and more as functional tool than as extraordinary objects of beauty and art. And these are ways of devaluing, whether it's explicit or not. And if you put those things together, you wind up with a perspective that is too narrow and inaccurate. I think it's worth saying, though, as on behalf of my colleagues as well, as we think about inheriting that, how do we go forward? And I think the most important thing here is that today we think and we work very differently. And so a good example for us is, as you know well, Darren, we are deep in the throes of a complete renovation and reinterpretation of our Northwest Coast Hall that was originally curated by Franz Boas. And as we do that today, we don't rely just on our own knowledge and point of view. It is being co-curated by a curator from our anthropology department, as well as a scholar and artist from the nycha First Nations, and also has 10 First Nations cultural curators, advising curators as well. And what is that about? That is about intentionally bringing in other voices, other perspectives, knowing that there are multiple ways of seeing and understanding cultures. And that in turn affects what we display from our collections, what we don't display. And so in the new galleries, there will be some objects that were there that aren't, that might have had a sacredness that we didn't fully appreciate, for example. There will be others that are brought out where we have learned from this consultative process, this collaboration and partnership, which is embedded in how we work now, that these are really quite important. So in the end, it's a much more complete perspective, a much deeper understanding, much more respectful. And one other thing, it also makes clear that these are living cultures. And too often, people think of Native American cultures as being of the past and not now. And I'll stop there, but I think it's an example of the difference in the way that we approach these things today versus that very narrow and often misleading perspective.
I couldn't agree more, Ellen. And I think the reinterpretation that you're doing, I think is desperately needed. And I think your leadership in ensuring that this is a part of your legacy is I think just going to be transformational for the museum. I think, Max, in your case, I think Ellen raises something really spot on. And that is our ideas of what constitute beauty, what constitutes worthiness, what is advanced, what is primitive, all of these ideas that are rooted in these eugenics theories are in your museum. I mean, there is no doubt yours and every major museum in America have categorized things from the dark continent as primitive. And so we see how art from the Igbo people in West Africa is presented in the 20th century, for example. We see how Picasso's references to African imagery is sort of fetishized, as opposed to understanding the centrality that at centrality actually Picasso discovered. I mean, he saw that as art, not as something primitive. So the way art history teaches us that what Picasso did was to perfect something that was primitive, rather than say Picasso learned art from Africans. That would have been too radical an idea.
From all of you.
And so how do you at the Metropolitan Museum, when you present all of this art, and as you say, you are the great encyclopedic museum, how do you present?
Well, I think that's, of course, that's one of the core questions. And I think you phrased it, of course, extremely well. And I also, like Ellen, of course, already summarized all these challenges in a very succinct way. Institutions like ours, yes, they have this idea to be a universal museum covering the entire world. But of course, they were built and they developed through a particular lens, a Western lens, that is, a lens then also through art history. And art history is very much almost like a technique to create hierarchies, to create categories, and to sustain them. And it's not only by scholars wanting to sustain it, but actually even artists wanting to sustain it. So you create a system, and it's very hard to break that system or kind of expand it. So you can see a whole like lineage here. Basically, yes, coming out of a certain Western idea that obviously connects with the idea of old masters. Just the word alone kind of has that in it, and then reconnecting to the ancient biblical lands, right? So we need to break that up clearly, and that's something that we are doing. On the other hand, you have an institution that has been that developed over the last 150 years. So you have these ideologies already somewhat ingrained in our footprint. If you come to the Met, you enter into the Great Hall, you have European paintings up the main stairway. You have Greek and Roman to the left. You have Egypt, which is, so to say, the one part of Africa that's basically is acceptable in a certain sense from previous times. So it's basically, you are in this kind of already developed system that you have to not dismantle, but completely like examine or open up and cross-fertilize, creating a much more cross-cultural dialogue, and also creating the same level of scholarship that you devote to these areas, to all the other areas that we've just talked about. So what we are doing right now is we are just in the midst of redoing what we call the Rockefeller Wing, which was one of the, on the one hand, trailblazing moments in the history of the Met, when the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas were put in the museum, ideally on equal footing to the other areas of art. But on the other hand, honestly, they were lumped together in a certain, like, one wing, as still with the other. And so,
Max,
yeah.
but wasn't it interesting that the Native American art was not seen as part of the American collection?
Exactly.
But actually, the Met has this grand, amazing American wing, and the Native collection was in the collection, the primitive collection.
That's exactly right. So that's exactly what we are doing right now, have been doing in the last couple of years. The American wing, which indeed is supposed to tell you the story of American art, and in that tells also the story of American history, but it tells more or less one story, the story of Manifest Destiny, kind of through the Hudson River School and others. So what we made sure is that more and different voices are being articulated there. Other works enter the collection. We have a very strong development in regard to indigenous art and indigenous cultures, same as like how Ellen described it, also making sure that it's kind of a living culture in itself. Hired curators who are, of course, experts in that area, and also have a certain deep rooting in these cultures. And then on the other hand, we also making sure that the presentation of the arts of Oceania, of the arts of Mesoamerica and Africa is done in a way that it's on a level with a scholarly mission and in an original basis that basically really brings all the different voices to play. So in a certain way, you are working within a system. On the one hand, reckoning with history, putting it out on the open where there are the deficiencies, and on the other hand, disentangling it, expanding it, and changing it. It will be a continuous process for sure, and something that, and I think it's important to do both. I think it's important to so to say expand and recreate, but on the other hand, also make it obvious how history came into being. Why that is, why so to say Greek and Roman is to the left and European paintings is up the staircase. I think both elements are extremely important to understand, because otherwise, in that sense, the Met is also a reflection of art history, and art history was written in that way. So in order to disentangle that and expand it, you need to make sure that also people understand how we got there and what the logical trends are. one last thing that I want to say that basically expands a little bit on what Alan was saying, where I think we are completely, not certainly aligned, but in lockstep in regard to what we're doing. But also what one has to acknowledge is that more often than not, the art itself, of course, carries some of the prejudices and some of the biases, or even some of eugenic thoughts in it. So it's not only how it's being displayed, but sometimes it's also the art itself. I mean, some fascination for Nordic cultures, you can see that you can see that in German expressionism. You can see that in many different areas. So you want to make that also more transparent.
Yeah, not anymore, not just
And Cristian,
this,
you lead this complicated global organization working with zoos and with wildlife conservation, with cultural presentation. For you, as you listen to Max and Alan, what are the implications in your field, in your profession, in your vertical, if you will, for eugenics today, and as you try to go forward, what are the challenges and how do you lead into this?
Well, let me start by saying, Darren, that I can very much relate to those. As you know, before coming to WCS, I led the Smithsonian Natural History Museum for 10 years, so I had to deal with a lot of the same questions. But of course, coming to WCS, our public-facing facilities are the zoo, like the Bronx Zoo. This is a slightly different but very important issue, because we're looking here at displaying nature and the relationship between people and nature. And of course, when you go back to what was going on at that time, when we were founded 126 years ago, you're looking at a vision of the world which excluded people from nature, and it also excluded the people that were in nature. And I think one of the most powerful examples that I see and that reflects our change has to do with the story of the American, you can see the Bronx Zoo and the relationship with Native American peoples. As we know, when we look back at our history as a nation, one of the most tragic episodes was the relationship that we had with the Native American tribes in the West. And as this group of people and the America was expanding westward, the bison and the people were decimated. That culture, that fabric, that braiding, that knowledge that was there was really lost. That's a very deliberate action. For so many of our founders, there was a vision that nature was there to be protected, to be preserved, and to be enjoyed. And if it meant that there were people in there that were in any way harming it from the joy and the opportunity to access it, this should be dealt with. And a lot of people were hunters. A lot of our founders were hunters that saw that the extinction of the American bison and many other species as a real threat. So it was even our first founding president, William Hornaday, who went out on an expedition to try and collect the last few remaining bison so that they could be put in museums for display for future generations, because they were going to be gone out. And he spent 2 years in the American West trying to find them. And what we found was a group of people interactions. There are people that had this deep connection with the land, where he really appreciated the connection of a species like the bison for them, and really, instead of killing them, brought them back to Smithsonian and to Bronx Zoo, where we were bred, and then we reintroduced them. Now, fast forward 100 years, which I think is the most important thing of what happened since then, is today, we're actively working with the Native American tribes in the West, with the Blackfeet Nation. Not only have we sent some of these bison back, but we're working with them in terms of bringing back some of these cultural practices and some of this rich tradition there. And we're bringing that knowledge to exhibits like the Bronx Zoo. And we bring that voice of what a bison means for these people, so that all the visitors that come to our facilities can see that. What happened was tragic. In this case, we're fortunate to be able to save this one species, but we did lose a lot of that connection. And it's going to be something we have to all work to bring back. And this story is playing itself out in other parts of the world right now. So we have to really look at this, the connection between people and nature.
It's very powerful. And this idea that so much of this was about progress, that we were as a society, as a nation, a world, through technology, through the unique innovation that man, especially American men, could advance in the world, would correlate with social progress and with economic development. So we've got about 10 minutes, and I would appreciate each of you reflecting on the kind of excavation that is going to be necessary, because this is hard work. And it's hard work because each of you has identified in your own institutions just how deeply embedded this legacy is, and what you are doing as a leader and your boards and your staff to take up the challenge. So let's, in closing, I'd love each of you to reflect on the go forward, how we get to a society, how your institution becomes the kind of institution that is truly anti-eugenics, that acknowledges that these ideas are antithetical to your values and to you personally, as each of you has done. But how do you manifest and make that an enduring, sustainable reality? And Max, I'll start with you, because I know the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a rich history and has a big board. It's not easy, as the three of you know. Well, you could give a seminar on managing boards, but not everyone agrees with everything. And not everyone agrees with every plan, every strategy, every implementation. But on this one, I think it is going to take you're bringing along a lot of people. And so how do you think about that? And what is your vision for your institution in this aspiration to be truly anti-eugenics?
September 29.
I think this is clearly not only a process that the museum is going through. I think it's a process also that America is going through in all its different layers. And it is a process of not only learning from history, but looking forward and being in not only of an open mind, but also having an understanding of how we look at certain things from the past and what that means for the future. I mean, just to give one example, it basically also means that you have to get people out of their comfort zone, have to get the institution out of its comfort zone. You will never find at the Met some kind of manifesto that we are based on eugenics or that we want to propagate that, but you have to almost look at every stone and say, well, here's something that we need to properly acknowledge. Here's something that we need to work on. Here's something that we need to expand on.